Kyle Klingman with Trackwrestling. Always love talking journalism and covering the sport of wrestling. Shannon Scovel does it as well as anyone. You have seen her work on the NCAA.com website, among other areas. We're going to dive into that, but great to have you on, Shannon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kyle.
Well, my understanding is that your passion for wrestling was stoked at American University in Teague Moore. Talk about that relationship.
Yes, Teague was the first wrestling coach that I interacted with at the collegiate level, and he was so welcoming to me, brought me into the community, was great with me as a student reporter, answered all my questions, gave me great access to the team. And I just loved covering the sport so much. My dad was a wrestler at Maryland, so I have a little bit of it in my blood, and to be able to have that connection with the sport and with my dad and with American University, it's just been a great experience and inspired me to want to keep writing wrestling.
You swam at American, but of course you got hooked into wrestling. What is it about wrestling that's unique from other sports?
Well, I actually think wrestling and swimming have a lot in common. I think that's what drew me to covering the sport. A lot of the ideas of toughness and grit that the wrestling coaches talk about, I've heard from coaches in swimming too. And so to have this Olympic sport connection with another sport that I think is a little bit undercovered in national media, I feel like I can play a role in helping amplify these stories that deserve to be told. And I think my background from swimming gives me a unique perspective on that. And I just love watching athletes put it all out on the line.
What do you think people need to know about wrestling? So if they're coming into the sport and they know nothing about it, what's been your experience about what people view the sport of wrestling?
I actually think wrestling does a great job covering itself within the community. There's so many wonderful outlets like yours that cover the sport so well, and a lot of sports can take lessons from that. Sports like swimming can amplify its coverage, but to draw people into the sport, I think it's just a matter of watching human beings give everything they have to compete against one another, to compete for their school, and to compete for pride and joy and competition. So I found it pretty easy to draw people in by telling the stories of human beings and helping them relate to these wrestlers as people.
Just from a journalistic point of view, what's your philosophy on journalism and how to articulate and tell a story in the right way?
Oh, that's such a good question. And this is a, I'm not usually the one answering the question, so this is going to take some thought. Um, but I think wrestling is like anything else. You know, it's a story. It has characters. It has a beginning. It has an end. It has a climax. It has all these exciting elements that draw us in. But what makes wrestling such a great sport for storytelling is the emotion. I mean, these athletes just pour themselves into this competition and they show it to you. And they're unlike football. You know, they're not wearing helmets. You see every part of their expression. You see their effort, and just these two guys doing battle on the mat. It's so ripe for storytelling.
When you sit down and you write a story, just from a journalistic point of view, how do you approach telling a story? Do you have notes that you take, or do you just kind of flow with what you want to get on paper, or not paper anymore, but on your screen? How do you actually approach a story?
Yeah, well, I've become a huge consumer of wrestling media. And again, to praise you and the work that you do, all of these wrestling outlets make it easy to be part of this community. So I start to learn about the guys through the stories that I read, through the watch matches that I've watched, and I try to bring those two things together to add my own unique perspective on the upcoming duel or the upcoming tournament. And then I just try to tell a story. I try to draw a reader into an individual and share their journey and explain why this match means so much, or what their strengths and weaknesses are, so that I can, again, make it more of a reading experience rather than just a list or facts.
Who are some of the great characters that you've come across that are good to tell their story and have an ability to jump off the page?
Yeah, well, T is the one I've had the most interactions with, and he's just a perfect wrestling character. National champion, loves the sport, has so much passion. Another coach that I've had some interactions with that really stands out is Tom Ryan. I actually just ordered his book. I've attended a couple of his speaking events. And again, the passion is just so inspiring and captivating. And it makes you want to interact with more of these coaches because you know they all care so much about what they do. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to watch their athletes succeed. And as an athlete, it's really inspiring to see coaches like that. Those are the coaches that can help make people great.
How'd you get involved with the NCAA? It's a great situation that you have. I know that you do some of the social media too, but how did this come on your plate?
Yeah, so I started as an intern for them in the fall of 2018. It was a year-long fellowship. And so I was doing pretty much everything that you would expect someone at an entry level to do. I was entering scores, I was updating the website, I was adding photos, and then I would write on the side. And so I started covering, I did a little bit of women's soccer coverage, I did some baseball, some softball, a little bit of everything, but wrestling was really where I found my niche at that organization. And I ended up becoming one of their primary writers, wrote for them for the entire 18-19 season, and then have worked in a freelance capacity since then.
Is that fun to be able to just have the creativity to freelance and tell the stories that you want to tell?
Oh, so much fun. I'm working on my PhD right now at the University of Maryland. So to have wrestling writing as a creative space for me to exist and tell stories, it's so much fun. It's such a nice complement to the academic work that I do to have a free space to play with words and share stories with readers.
How do we get more women in the wrestling journalism space?
Oh, this is my favorite question. I just actually wrote and hoping to publish a journal article on women's wrestling media coverage. So I'm really excited about this question. I think that it's so logical to want to bring women into the sport. It's a great way to grow the sport. And wrestling media needs to support it. And I think there are a lot of outlets that do, and that's great. I think it's fantastic to see these schools sponsoring programs. Great that women's wrestling has become an emerging sport at the NCAA. If we can get women on the college stage in these great matches with national television coverage, I think we can grow it. I'm a firm believer that media exposure can drive interest. And I believe that for all sports across the board. But wrestling does such a great job of covering itself that it makes so much sense to add more women's coverage and tell more women's stories. If you love wrestling, you love wrestling, whether it's women's wrestling, men's wrestling, regardless. I've watched a couple of these cards in the last couple of weeks, and the women's matches have been outstanding. So I think it's great that women are getting the opportunity to compete at these on these cards and at this level. And if we can just continue to promote that and grow that, it will continue to grow the sport.
And it's got to be fun for you to see how women's wrestling is growing at this point.
Absolutely. It's so exciting. And I think it's great for women's sports across the board.
How did you first find out about women's wrestling? I don't know if you knew about it much when you went to American and associated with Teague, but when did women's wrestling become on your radar?
Yeah, so it was actually through Teague that I met Sally Roberts. So I was freelancing for a couple of different outlets at the time. And one of the outlets that I was working for was this outlet called Purpose to Play. And so I did a story about women's wrestling shoes, and it actually has inspired some of my academic research on women's wrestling. So I met Sally, and her passion for wrestling was so contagious too, that I just continued to stay in the circle. And now the work that she's doing with Wrestle Like a Girl is great. Some of the panels that they've put on this summer have been phenomenal. So again, just like the wrestling as a sport, it's so easy to get involved in these communities and feel excited about the progress that's being made towards inclusion.
Tell us about women's wrestling shoes, the story angle you had there. That's interesting.
Yeah, so Sally was telling me that they don't have wrestling shoes for women. And I know that there have been some changes in this space. I know Adeline Gray had her own shoe, but I've been reading about the women's foot and how, when women's running, you can buy women's running shoes. You don't have to go to the men's section of the store and buy men's shoes in smaller sizes. And so learning a little bit more about how that works with wrestling and the push to create a women's wrestling shoe that's really designed for the women's foot, for women's competition, is really interesting. And actually Under Armour just came out with a new women's basketball shoe for the women's foot. So we're seeing this kind of work being done in all sports. And so to tie it back to wrestling, it's exciting to see that hopefully we can get to the point where these shoes exist and young girls have an opportunity to go into a store, buy a women's shoe and not have to go to the men's section and say that the shoe is for them as well.
When did you first become interested in journalism?
Really young, actually. My mom was a journalism major at Maryland, so it was the classic wanting to be like your parents situation. So I started writing for my high school newspaper and then freelancing for my local town paper. I had a fabulous editor in high school at the local town paper who let me freelance for them. So that was a great experience in the professional journalism world at 18 years old. And then I continued to write through college and then after college and now more studying it from an academic perspective, but really feel passionately about journalism and love storytelling.
When did you realize you maybe had an inclination toward it? Did you have a natural way to ask questions? I mean, did you kind of notice some skills you had early on?
That's a really good question. I think I liked the idea of telling stories. I was kind of shy, so it was a nice way to express myself, but then I had to grow into that reporter role where I am summoning the courage to ask questions. And I think having that experience in high school getting to cover athletes. I loved sports, so to be able to do sports journalism, it just seemed like a perfect fit for someone who likes to write and also likes to watch and compete in sports.
What do you want to do with your PhD?
Hopefully, I'll be able to teach and do research at a university. I'm teaching a little bit now through my program, and I'm just really loving it. I hope to continue to study it through this theoretical lens and identify ways that we can improve journalism and make it more inclusive.
You do triathlons. How hard is it to finish an Ironman?
It's the coolest experience of my life. I've done 2 of them. I did Ironman Bolton in the UK while I was getting my master's degree abroad, and then I did Kona in 2018 as well. There's nothing harder than that marathon at the end. I think it's the most pain I've been in my entire life. But overcoming that feeling of crossing the finish line, it's a unique experience unlike anything else. I want to do another one.
As far as just preparing for one of those, I mean, what do you have to focus on? Do you have to just kind of slice it up throughout the week? How do you prepare for an Ironman?
Yeah, so for both instances, I hired an outside coach who wrote a training plan for me based around my work schedule and school schedule. Um, and in college, I was training 20 hours a week, so it wasn't that much different. It was maybe 25 or 30, but you do a couple 3 to 4 workouts per sport per week, and then you do some of the long rides, the 80 milers, the 90 milers, the hundreds, followed by the long runs, 17, 18, 19 mile runs. But I look forward to those workouts as a chance to test myself. And I look forward to training for another one, hopefully soon.
Are there wrestling stories out there that aren't being told that we need to know about?
Women's wrestling stories. But I think that there's a great pattern and example of how to cover wrestling when we're seeing wrestling coverage grow. I really do think that wrestling is a great example for other sports. I've been so inspired by the wrestling reporting that's being done. I think there's so many more people in the space now and so many more outlets doing this work. It's great for readers. There's so many places they can go. And with the more unique perspectives we have in wrestling journalism, the more unique stories that are going to be told. And I think if we can just amplify those women's stories to the degree that we've amplified men, we're going to get more coverage, more experiences, more stories being told, and we're going to inspire participation. I believe that if you see someone that looks like you doing your sport and being covered in an article, you might be inspired to go try the sport. So hopefully if we can continue to cover women like we've covered men, we'll see a great growth in participation and coverage.
How long before we go all online, no more newspapers?
Oh, what a sad day. I don't know. That's a really good question and something I've thought a lot about. It's interesting with the Post being supported by Jeff Bezos. That's a unique partnership. I interned at Sports Illustrated, and it's sort of sad to see that magazine not being printed weekly. I don't know. I think people like print. I print out all my readings for school. There's something nice about holding physical copies. So I think we might see more unique partnerships like the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos. I think people are going to have to be more creative if they feel like that print matters, and I think it does. But it's going to be up to outlets to make that commitment.
All right, doesn't have to be wrestling, but who are a couple, 3 of your favorite journalists that you like to read?
Oh, great. Christine Brennan, USA Today, Liz Clark, Washington Post, and I'm going to butcher her last name, which is so bad, Isabel Krishidian. That's not right. She is a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post based in Moscow, Russia, and she served as a huge mentor to me in college. So I feel really bad that I can't pronounce her last name. But those 3 women have really inspired me and keep me going in this industry.